Welcome to Women Leading in Health. I'm Dr. Linda Edwards, and this is the podcast series that explores the skills and mindset required to lead in the world of health and medicine. Whether it will be an emphasis on teamwork, communication, or adaptability, I'll be finding out what makes these female leaders tick and how others can model their success. Today, I'm joined by Caroline Gilmartin, who's the strategic lead for primary care nursing at City and Hackney GP Confederation. Welcome, Caroline.
Thanks, Linda. Nice to see you.
And you. It would be really helpful to our listeners if you could just tell us a little bit about your career pathway and how you ended up where you are.
Oh, now there's a tale. So I started my NHS career many moons ago, but as a nurse. So I came into working in healthcare through a clinical route, and I have stuck with the NHS ever since, but worked in a variety of different roles. So I have shifted from a completely clinical role to a clinical role and a quality role, sort of shared role, nursing leadership, shared with clinical practice role, then moved very much into, as various different reorganisations happened across the NHS, which is one of the NHS's specialities. I've moved into more kind of managerial roles, taken a little bit of a detour out into education and training, which is something that I'm really interested in. I've been interested in my whole career. But then come back in and kind of taken myself down the commissioning route as the Director of Integrated Commissioning, working in East London and then in South East London. So it's been a meandering road. I guess I've come full circle back to when I stepped away from my director's roles. I stepped back to working in a much more frontline operational role, which was a lovely change, I have to say, as I found the joy of delivering services again. And that took me through COVID, the Afghan refugee crisis, and now I'm back into a more strategic role, working on developing the nursing workforce in primary care. So in many ways, kind of back to a more senior iteration of a role I had when, in the very early days of my management career. So as I say, a wander along the paths, the highways and byways.
So there must have been some key moments along the way. Could you share one or two of those with us?
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about that. I stepped out of being a full-time clinician where I was working as a general practice nurse and kind of tried to create what we would now call communities of practice, because general practice nursing was very different type of area whereby you're quite solitary unless you've got a lot of colleagues. And certainly back when I was first doing it in the sort of 90s, you'd say last century, practices had one or two nurses, but we were a kind of a relatively new breed, fighting our corner for recognition, for education and training, really having to be kind of very, very self-starting. I loved that. I found that very refreshing. I found it very challenging. It awoke my sort of curiosity for education and training and my passion about kind of getting people to work together and share and support each other. But it also awoke in me a kind of a real worry and concern about the kind of situations that people could find themselves in as nurses in a very unstructured, unsupervised environment, and the issues that could arise for them as professionals, but actually also the patients, because people were finding themselves doing things that they were not really competent or qualified to do and being expected to do them. So kind of realising that was going on quite a lot, I wanted to step away and create and work with what was then called the Family Health Services Authorities. You'll remember those, Linda. and kind of work with people that were operating within that structure to create some sort of safety netting and hierarchy and pathway through for nurses that were entering into general practice nursing. And I guess that sort of step away, so there was a, hang on a minute, there's a bigger thing that needs to be done here than me just kind of sitting and seeing my patients. Much as I absolutely adore this and I feel very clinically fulfilled by it, I can see that there's another role. So that was a very defining moment for me. And then moving into something that required me to behave differently, to think differently, to interact with different parts of the NHS that I hadn't expected to be a leader, really, and to boldly go into quite tricky situations, negotiate my way around and through them. That was very developmental. And I knew I could never go fully back into clinical practice from that. I enjoyed it and I wanted to move on from there. So I'd say that was the first defining moment. And then from that, I'd say the second defining moment for me was the point at which we moved in the NHS from strategic health authorities into much smaller organisations. I think we started with primary care groups and then we moved on to primary care trusts. I went to work in a primary care group and I worked with a young and really talented bunch of managers, people that were, were really on a pathway, but very, very committed to delivering new. We knew our patch. We had a borough that was a patch. We knew our patch. We knew our councils. We knew the services. We knew the voluntary sector. And I went into that team and worked very closely with both the chief executive and the director of commissioning at that time, or director of primary care, I think it was. And we made change happen. We made some really good change happen. We used all the levers that we had. And it was exciting and stimulating and felt really worthwhile. So that's when I got the sort of the real, I can step onto this management ladder and away from clinical practice and I can still do things, which was what I then went on to do over a number of years, really. So I'd say those were the really big kind of things that helped me to kind of define where I ultimately ended up playing out most of my career. But I have to say that I've never lost my sort of clinical core, and I've used my clinical skills and expertise and knowledge and understanding about the way professionals work, understanding of general practice on the ground, all the way through. And I think that's the beauty for me of the career that I've been able to build, that it was always a build up of a building on skills, never walking away, but always taking the next thing in my backpack and taking it on to the next challenge and the next role.
I think that's really important because I think a lot of people who are in clinical roles are actually quite concerned that they waste their clinical skills if they moved into a different type of role. But clearly that's not been the case for you.
Never. I guess I've been lucky with the boards that I've sat on. The boards that I've sat on have had a lot of clinicians sitting around the table who are still very much actively in clinical practice. So I've been able to relate very strongly to where they're coming from at the same time as holding the other, and yet we need to do this element in my mind. But I think for me, that defining sort of clinical lens, I think once you've got it, you never lose it. It's my view. You might lose the clinical. I mean, I wouldn't put myself in front of a patient. Let's be clear about that. But it's a way of thinking and a way of kind of addressing a problem or a set of problems or a set of circumstances in a way that you take with you. And you can speak clinical, and that's super helpful. You're never afraid to say, I don't understand what that 3-letter acronym that you just said was. Is it PID for project initiation document, pelvic inflammatory disease, prolapsed vertebral disc? Tell me. I don't feel stupid asking you.
I know. I think it's a huge advantage having had clinical experience in any senior role, actually, in the NHS. But who's inspired you, and what was it about them that inspired you?
Oh, so many people over the course of the years, I guess. I've seen really inspirational people come through that, in a very unexpected way. I'm thinking about a director of finance that I first worked with and met when I was working in the East End of London, who's now kind of the head honcho at NHSE London as well, who was very different in the way that they approached things, was very financially astute, but was absolutely grounded in what we're here to do is to make this service work and to make this service work for patients. So money was never the first thing that you were talking about. You were always talking about how you use the resources that you've got in order to do the most important things that we had to do and how to prioritize in relation to that. So that for me was very inspirational because it was about actually everybody's here to, with the same goal in mind. And that's how I need to work with colleagues that have come from an incredibly different background. I've worked with incredibly inspiring clinicians. I can think of a number of both GPs and nurses who have their capacity and capability for making things happen, for creating change by just not being scared to take on a challenge and to go for it and to demonstrate that all these constraints that everybody is saying that there is actually, yes, we need to work with inside them, but actually we can do a heck of a lot by actually being brave and making change as we go along. I've worked with some people who have been completely focused on doing some of the really hard stuff, actually, which is working out where something's going wrong, hypothesizing about what that might be, finding the information and actually kind of doing something to make the change, either make sure that the lessons were learned or actually, really dig deep into a service and make the case for whether or not that service could continue to exist. And indeed that practitioner or that group of people were up to the jobs that they're doing. And there's a level of bravery in that I find really inspiring because it doesn't win you friends. Let's just put it like that. There's lots of examples of people that do some really tricky things, but it's very tough work, and you have to be dedicated to it, and you need to be supported within that. So inspiration comes in lots of ways, in lots of places, but I'd say also inspiration can be just there along the way. I mean, recently I ran the COVID vaccination clinics in a local area in East London. And I was absolutely blown away and found inspiration in the energy of the volunteers, the volunteering service, the ability of the receptionists to come up with much better processes than we thought about and to kind of like champion them, the dedication of the cleaners and the security guards and the council teams that were supporting us to kind of, so like, in many ways, it's great to draw inspiration and allow yourself to draw inspiration from lots of different places, because I think that's what keeps you going. I would say.
So you mentioned people making tough decisions. What's been one of the toughest decisions that you've made, and how did you navigate your way through?
Some of the hardest decisions that I've made have been in relation to two services that were not performing, that weren't responding to the chances that they were getting, or the route map that they were kind of putting in place to, or the improvement plan that they needed to meet in order to respond, and actually making a decision to go in and close those services, knowing the impact on patients, the impact on other services that need to take up the slack. And I would say that it's always a team decision, those sorts of things. So you're making those decisions with others, but you're carrying, well, I have been in the position of carrying the responsibility for making sure that everything that needs to be in place to support the chair and the chief exec to say, yes, okay, we agree with you, go for it, is in place. So my responsibility is being sort of really wide in terms of all the way from what is it that we're going to do if we get the go-ahead to go live on this to it's okay, we've covered it all and we've written it down and have a look and this is what we are going to be doing. Okay, team, we're actually not going home this weekend. So I guess those always feel like they're the really trickiest things to navigate in a managerial sort of sense, really, across the board.
Because they're never easy, those decisions, are you? Do you think women and men manage and lead differently? Or is it just a smoke screen?
Yes, my experience in the health service is that they do. My preference, just going to say this out loud, my preference is always to work with women leaders. It's something that, I guess it's borne out of a whole range of things, but I found the approach much easier. I think women communicate differently. I think they can be just as steely, but somehow there is a sort of an ability to empathize behind that steeliness. In my experience, I think that, which is not to put men down on any level, it is, for me, it is about preference. I think with the kind of the senior, particularly the chief execs, the male chief execs that I've worked with, I have found that that person's got a 2-year-old, that person's got 3 kids that they've got to get to school, this person's caring for their mother, that person's got a long-term condition. It's just a sort of a set of, whereas I've always, I see that sort of shifting going through, which is not to say that you don't get to the same place, but it just feels a bit gentler somehow in the way that you can get there. Horses for courses, I guess, but that would be that's my stereotypical and but also personal experience as we sort of go through things. I also feel men can be more confident. I think women have got a bit of more of a imposter syndrome, an ability to kind of feel imposter syndrome and to be honest about the fact that they're feeling imposter syndrome and to apologize for themselves. And sitting around board tables, I found that the boardroom tables I have found at times that the male voice is listened to or heard more explicitly than the female voice. I found myself at times having said something and then having it said again by a male colleague and it being heard when the male has said it, but not heard when I have said it or any of my female colleagues have said it. So that's an interesting dynamic.
Can be quite amusing that at times, can't it?
Well, it's good to be amused by it. I could say annoying myself.
So how do you maintain some balance in your life?
Well, I'm going to say that's not my greatest skill. So to anybody that's listening, don't do like me, but I have got better at it. I have had some very helpful coaching over the course of my career. I have done some NLP training. I've done mindfulness. I've done a whole range of different sort of, let's go back to the core. Let's just really think about what's going on here. Think about how you can stay resourceful within a situation and kind of move on and not let it get on top of you. So all of that, I think, has really helped to get me through. Certainly coaching, I think, is one of the things that is incredibly useful to keep going, particularly, well, actually, I think across the board. I think there's a whole, even the health coaching sort of agenda is kind of rising to the top level, which is great, I think, because I think it empowers people to be kind of owning what's going on for them and thinking about it. And I think that's exactly the same when you're in a management situation. But I think you have to have times where you turn off. I think you have to put your phone down. I think you have to not look at your emails. I think you need to have very clear boundaries. You need to take holidays, all of the above, and you need to be clear about when you're getting overloaded and be prepared to sort of say, okay, so what is it? How do I deal with this? As opposed to solely feeling like you've got to power through. So I think there's a multitude of ways that I would now deal with it, but I have had to really learn that over the years. And at times, it doesn't always even feel possible that you can look after yourself. And I'm very conscious of that. Right now, as I think people working in health and social care services are so burnt out, kind of post-pandemic, and actually pulling that back into a place where you've lost the burnout and you can feel the joy again. You need help. I mean, organisations need to help, like the government there has to be a sort of a sense of let's nurture our workforce to keep our workforce. So do it to yourself, but actually also do it for others. It's very, very real and takes continuous effort to make sure that you are okay and that you are able to operate at the top of your game.
That's so important. As you say, people are exhausted. I think there's something about not beating yourself up if you don't do it as well as you think you should be doing it. But given all of that, and we've actually talked around quite a few things this afternoon, what would be a key piece of advice you would give to somebody embarking on an NHS career right now?
First of all, love it. It's just a fantastically brilliant place and space to be in. As a place to work, as an organisation, it's almost an organism, I would say. As an organism to be working within, there will be endless opportunities for you, and you need to, be alive and open to them. Learn from the people around you, find the good people, watch them, get mentors, open yourself up to asking people for help, because they will be really delighted to help you along the way. You're in it for the long game. And if you're in it for the long game, that means you can take your time. You don't need to kind of climb the greasy pole ladder really, really quickly. Give yourself time to, get the expertise that you need at the level that you're working. And look around. Don't be afraid to step outside of the NHS and go do something else. You can always come back to it. It's there. And it will welcome you back with open arms, and actually getting a different perspective. Sometimes it's really helpful too. And I say that to you if you're a clinician or a non-clinician. Looking at something from a different point on the compass is sometimes a really, really helpful thing to do. But stay safe, stay sane. Work well.
Staying sane is always the challenge, isn't it? Thank you so much, Caroline. That's been great.
Oh, it's lovely to chat to you, Linda.
If you enjoyed this episode, then I'd really appreciate it if you could rate, review and subscribe. If you're keen to carry on this conversation, then you can find us at Ed for Health over on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you.